Thank you for joining me as I conclude my examination of The Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel and also conclude the final Atheist Reads series. This is the last one. But we're not quite done yet. We have one chapter left in the final book, so let's take a look at Chapter 11, The Cumulative Case for a Creator. Strobel opens by recalling the Ford Pinto trial, which he covered back when he was still a journalist, which was 40 years ago. A van driver had rear-ended a woman driving a Ford Pinto, causing the Pinto to explode. The accident led to Ford Motor Company being charged with reckless homicide for ignoring faults in the Pinto's design that allowed the explosion to happen. Strobel covered this story as a journalist, won an award for his coverage, and then wrote a book about it called Reckless Homicide. So, Strobel describes how confident the prosecutor was in the case, how certain he was that he would win a conviction based on the testimony of the van driver who was cooperating with the prosecution. But the defense attorneys for Ford went beyond the obvious, posed questions that others weren't asking, out-hustled police investigators, and followed the clues wherever they led, and ultimately won the case. Ford was acquitted. Strobel says that he knows how the prosecutor felt. Quote, "When Christians approached me about the evidence for their faith, I was as defiant as the combative prosecutor on the courthouse steps. The origin of species trumped the Bible. The critical thinking of scientists overwhelmed the wishful thinking of theists. To me, the case was closed." Well, I get that Strobel is just being glib here, but hopefully we all recognize that the case for evolution rests on more than which book you trust, the Bible or the origin of species. The Bible has only its own claims to authority to support itself, while the ideas contained within the origin have been tested, substantiated, modified, and expanded over a century and a half of research and experimentation and work across multiple fields of scientific inquiry. It's really no comparison between the two in terms of science. It's not the Bible versus the origin, which do you trust? It's not Jesus versus Darwin. It's a religious text that lacks any significant scientific or historical support versus a robust and evolving scientific consensus assembled over a period of many decades by many different people working all over the world. But Strobel doesn't see it that way. He thinks he's got a strong and well-supported case of his own, a case that contradicts much of the scientific consensus, a case so overwhelming that he believes anyone who honestly studies the subjects it addresses will be convinced of its validity. Except, of course, for the overwhelming majority of the world's scientists. So anyway, here we are at the end. So let's review. What is the case for a creator? Strobel recalls how important the life, teachings, and resurrection of Jesus Christ were in convincing him to convert to Christianity in 1981. But the corroborating scientific facts were also important. Back then, Strobel analyzed the scientific research and concluded that the data of the physical world point powerfully toward the existence of a creator. After researching and writing this book, Strobel once again sat down to examine the data to determine which hypothesis, Darwinism or design, best accounted for the scientific evidence. Recalling Jonathan Wells, who we interviewed earlier in the book, Strobel writes that if a theory doesn't fit the evidence, then it must be either reevaluated or abandoned. Strobel declares that Darwinism is too far-fetched to be credible. Why? Because in order to believe Darwinism and more generally naturalism, one has to believe also that nothing produces everything, that non-life produces life, that randomness produces fine-tuning, that chaos produces information, that unconsciousness produces consciousness, and that non-reason produces reason. Why'd Strobel even bother interviewing William Lane Craig for this when he can do Craig's shtick as good as Craig can? Could have saved some time, an airplane ticket, at least. Strobel attempts to frame Darwinism and naturalism as far-fetched by presenting them as resting on a series of seeming contradictions. He says, you have to believe that nothing produces everything, which he knows sounds preposterous. But there are complexities to that question he's leaving out. For instance, what do we mean by nothing? It's possible, maybe even likely, that absolute philosophical nothingness doesn't really exist. Or not exist, you know what I'm saying. Even empty space is something. It's possible that there is always something. And we can't say that there was nothing before our universe existed. We can't really speak to that at all, because we have no evidence for anything that happened before the Big Bang. As far as we know, the Big Bang represents the beginning of a closed system. We have no information going back further than that point. In fact, we can't even get back to that point scientifically. Our fundamental physics, our laws, our theories all break down when you reach that point of singularity, that point of infinite mass when the Big Bang supposedly happened, or before the Big Bang happened. So we can't really speak to that at all. So when a creationist says that without God you have to believe that nothing spontaneously created everything, they're just talking out of their ass. They're just making things up that sound convincing, that sound like it supports their narrative. We have no idea what happened. We don't know exactly what happened. We don't know how the circumstance that led to the Big Bang came to be. We understand a lot, we think, about what happened in the immediate aftermath of the Big Bang. We've made great strides in understanding how the universe came to be the way it is today from those early moments. And we're still discovering things and still exploring all of these questions. But as far as what caused the Big Bang, if that is even a meaningful question, what preceded the Big Bang, where did the Big Bang come from? All of we don't know. We have no idea. Did something come from nothing? We don't know, is the most honest question, or the most honest answer to that question. So, and let me remind you that after emphasizing how silly it is to believe that everything came from nothing, creationists usually turn around and insist that creating everything from nothing is exactly what their God did. But that's different, they say, because they imagine their God has the ability to do that. So believing in impossible things is fine as long as you also believe in something that can make the impossible things happen. And that is science. The other items in Strobel's list, which are presented as though they are contradictory, are actually less contradictory than he wants them to appear. There's nothing absurd or illogical about the notion of non-life producing life. Strobel and other apologists want us to regard life as a magical thing that requires a divine spark in order to happen, but the truth is that life is the result of complex natural processes, and while it is a wondrous and precious thing to us, there is nothing magical or miraculous about it. Randomness and fine-tuning are also very misleading terms, because nature doesn't necessarily operate randomly, but rather according to discoverable, understandable principles and regular, predictable patterns. And fine-tuning, in the sense that Strobel means, doesn't actually exist. As I said back when we were talking about that chapter, there is a fine-tuning problem in cosmology, but it is not the same thing that Strobel and other apologists and creationists are talking about. It's not, why is the universe so well suited to us? It's a much more complicated cosmological and physical problem. What Strobel calls evidence of fine-tuning, I call objects existing in the universe which are permitted to exist by the conditions of the universe, which is exactly what we would expect to find. Chaos produces information is similar to randomness produces fine-tuning. The fact is, order can and does emerge from apparent chaos in nature. Nature consists of both predictable order and what we experience or perceive as unpredictable chaos, and sometimes one gives rise to the other. And if information here is an allusion to genetics, I need to mention that information in this sense is molecules doing things, because that's what DNA is. And those molecules do not interact chaotically, but chemically. Now, the last two on the list are also very similar. unconsciousness produces consciousness, and non-reason produces reason. As with the incredulity about non-life producing life, there is no logical reason to scoff at the suggestion that consciousness could arise from unconscious processes, or that the capacity to reason could arise from processes that are not capable of reason themselves. If you don't understand the underlying processes, or you refuse to understand them, or you assume going in that they can't be understood, then it might seem ridiculous to you that water can produce ice. Because how can a liquid produce a solid? That just doesn't make sense. Those two things are fundamentally different. But if you understand what's actually happening and you don't insist on mystifying it, it's not far-fetched at all. It's very, very easily understood. Strobel reminds us that Stephen Meyer says that origin of life researchers face insurmountable hurdles when attempting to explain the natural origin of biological information, and that these problems cannot be resolved by more research and effort. Flat out. They will never solve these problems. These are insurmountable obstacles. So just hang it up, scientists. Sorry, you've had a good run, but a creationist has decided, on the basis of his own ignorance, lack of imagination, and dogmatic beliefs, that the questions you're trying to answer can't be answered scientifically, no matter how long or what you're trying to do to answer those questions. Sorry. J.P. Moreland said something similar, if you recall. They'll just never answer those questions. Or that's a level that science will never attain. I think he was talking about artificial intelligence. Like, computers will never attain true intelligence. They just never will. It's just a fact. It's just never going to happen. It's just not possible. How does he know? How does Stephen Meyer know that what he perceives as insurmountable hurdles in naturally explaining the origin of life will just never be resolved? That science will never be able to answer this question just because it has not provided a complete answer to date? How does he know that? Strobel goes over the supposedly glaring deficiencies in the fossil record, distorting the nature of the Cambrian explosion and falsely claiming that it can't be accounted for naturally. We went through this in the chapter about the fossil record and the Cambrian explosion. He repeats the old creationist chestnut that sure, microevolution happens, we all know that, but there's no way macroevolution can happen because sure, if you add one penny to another penny, you've got 2 pennies. But no matter how many pennies you add, you'll never ever get to $1 million. That's just silly. Quote, in short, the amount of faith needed to maintain the belief in the most sweeping and controversial claims of Darwinism far exceeded what I believed was reasonably warranted by the hard evidence of science. On top of that, naturalism has absolutely no credible explanation for how the universe came into being in the first place. Well, it's worth noting that what Strobel considers the most controversial claims of Darwinism are aspects of evolutionary theory on which almost everyone agrees. He rarely, if ever, mentions actual scientific controversies in this book, things which real scientists really disagree with each other about. In this book, macroevolution and the emergence of complex systems are controversial subjects. In reality, they are anything but controversial subjects among proper evolutionary scientists. So we'll call that option 1, all of that. Darwinism, evolution, naturalism. He uses these terms interchangeably because clearly he knows what he's talking about. So if that's option 1 and all of that is busted, that's not a valid explanation, what about option 2? Design. Strobel declares that in this investigation, he has probed 6 different scientific disciplines: cosmology, physics, astronomy, biochemistry, biological information, and consciousness. Pretty sure a few of those aren't actual scientific disciplines, but they are studied by scientists who are working within particular disciplines, so, okay, sure. Let's remind ourselves who Strobel, the investigative reporter following the facts wherever they lead, consulted for guidance on these 6 scientific subjects. Cosmology. He interviewed William Lane Craig. Not a cosmologist, not a scientist at all. Physics. He interviewed Robin Collins. Not a physicist, not a scientist at all. Astronomy. He interviewed J. Wesley Richards. Not an astronomer, not a scientist at all. And he interviewed Guillermo Gonzalez, an astronomer, a proper scientist, but one who no longer has a career as a serious research scientist because he's a proponent of intelligent design, which isn't science. Biochemistry. Michael Behe, a biologist, a proper scientist, but one who has been disavowed by name by his own university's biology department. Biological information. Stephen Meyer, not a biologist, not a scientist. Consciousness. J.P. Moreland, not a neuroscientist, not a scientist at all. After interviewing these unqualified non-experts about their rejected and discredited ideas, Strobel has concluded, again, that the scientific evidence points to the universe and everything in it, including us being products of design. Imagine that. Strobel urges skeptics, any skeptics or seekers who are reading this book, to investigate the evidence for themselves. And he offers 3 questions to guide our investigation. Those 3 questions are, is there a God who created the universe? Did God reveal himself to humankind through the Bible or other sacred scriptures? Is Jesus the Son of God, deity united with humanity, and can he help us as he claimed? Yes, those are certainly the sorts of questions we should be asking at the beginning of a scientific investigation. Only the first question even comes close to being an honest question, and it is loaded in favor of Strobel's preferred answer. Instead of asking, where did the universe come from, Strobel suggests asking the question in a way that positions his God as the default answer. The second and third questions assume that the answer to the first question will be yes, which is good form for a manipulative pitch, but not so great as far as the scientific method goes. And just in case the questions aren't prejudicial enough, Strobel goes on to declare that if you do conduct your own investigation, you'll soon find that the universe is governed by both physical and spiritual laws. The physical laws point us toward the Creator. The spiritual laws tell us how we can know him personally, both today and forever. Well, no point in conducting the investigation then, I guess. Lee just spoiled the ending. Hey, don't take my word for it. Conduct your own examination of the evidence and decide for yourself if God exists, Jesus is his son, and has a wonderful plan for your life. But spoiler alert, they do. And that's not just me saying that. It's the scientific data. It occurs to me, as I close out this book, that the case for a creator falls apart for the same reasons as the case for Lee Strobel as a credible person falls apart. Both cases sound good and might actually be fairly solid as long as you take them at their word and ignore the mountains of evidence to the contrary. If you trust that Strobel's chosen experts know what they're talking about and don't think too hard about what they're saying, the case sounds convincing. It's only when you factor in the fact that Strobel's experts are contradicted by the overwhelming consensus of the world's scientists, and also notice that their characterizations of some basic and fairly important scientific ideas and pieces of evidence are extremely misleading, that the case collapses. By the same token, if you take Strobel at face value that he is a good reporter, a journalist, and he's just after the truth no matter what it is, he seems superficially credible. He asks questions. He exhibits a certain level of curiosity. He's able to write in complete sentences, not good sentences from a stylistic point of view, certainly, but grammatically adequate. But then you start to notice things like the fact that he claims to be conducting a journalistic investigation of what science tells us about the possibility of the existence of God, an investigation that leads him into discussions of the theory of evolution, the Big Bang, and other areas of cosmology, physics, genetics, the workings of the brain and consciousness. And yet, in his entire book, he interviews 3 people who could be described as scientists: Jonathan Wells, Guillermo Gonzalez, and Michael Behe. That's 3 of his 8 interview subjects. And none of those 3 represent the views of the scientific consensus. In fact, no one represents the scientific consensus, save for Strobel himself, when he summarizes the mainstream scientific view to allow his subject to rebut it. He claims to only care about the truth, and he just wants to go wherever the evidence takes him. But he tells us almost nothing about what the scientific consensus on these issues actually says. And when he does share it, what he shares of it is distorted or incomplete. He allows his interview subjects to frame scientific concepts in ways that benefit them and their spurious ideas. And there's no one present in the text at any point who is capable of making a counter-argument or pointing out when Strobel's subjects have said something false or misleading. Imagine for a moment that we're not talking about scientific evidence for God. Imagine someone has written a book declaring that they are going to investigate whether or not humans landed on the moon. Sure, it's a bit of a red flag that the author is treating this as a controversial subject in the first place, but then they go on to interview only moon hoax conspiracy theorists, all of whom are presented as reasonable, credible, reliable people. Meanwhile, the historical and scientific evidence for the moon landings is paid little more than token lip service, and no actual historians, scientists, engineers, astronauts, or representatives of NASA are interviewed. When that hypothetical author insists that they are just a reporter interested in the truth, do you take them seriously? Or do you recognize them for what they are? Creationists aren't scientists. What they do isn't science. And what Lee Strobel does isn't journalism. He isn't a journalist. He was at one time, but not anymore. What he is now is a salesman. And I don't mean to disparage salespeople. No shame in being a salesperson as long as you're honest and you don't seek to take advantage of people. And there's the problem, because that's not the type of salesman Lee Strobel is. He's not honest about what he's doing. He tells you that he's not a salesman, he's a journalist. He's an investigative reporter. He's won awards for his reporting. But this book isn't a work of journalism or science or history. It's an attempt to leverage your pre-existing beliefs and biases, or absent those, your assumed ignorance and lack of curiosity about the subjects at hand, in order to sell you a faulty product. If you want to know what science tells us about where the universe came from, about how life evolves, about where we come from, read a science book. Read lots of science books. Learn the facts. The world is a beautiful place. The universe is big and awesome and mysterious and wonderful, and there's more of it than we can ever know, but we can explore and understand some of it at least. And if you want to go beyond the cold hard facts, if you want to explore what it all means, read some philosophy. Hell, study religion, not as an acolyte, but as a student, as someone who wants to understand different human cultures and how they have tried to answer these questions. Aaron Ra likes to say that science doesn't know everything, but religion doesn't know anything. And I think that's a little reductive, all due respect to Aaron. Religion isn't necessarily an entirely pointless exercise. I know it adds value to the lives of many people. But in the wrong hands, used for the wrong purposes, it can be extremely destructive. And it's not science. It's not history. It's not a product of anything divine. It's a human creation, and it shouldn't ever be mistaken for anything else. If the case for a creator was as strong as Strobel says it is, he wouldn't have to leave so much of the counter-evidence out in order to make it look good. The truth is, there is no convincing scientific case for a creator. The universe, life, ourselves, our genetics, our consciousness, there are still important questions about all of these things that have not yet been answered. But none of those problems are impossible to solve without assuming the existence of God. Belief in God is simply optional. Science doesn't say you absolutely must not believe in God, but nor does it say you have to in order for everything to make sense. And that is what apologists are telling you. Apologetics itself is really just one big argument from incredulity. The basic argument of almost every apologist is that God must exist because that's the only way they can think of to make everything make sense. And here at the end of my 25th and final series devoted to reading and responding to books like this one, I can say that I am grateful that progress in science, philosophy, history, art, culture, and humanity does not depend on the intellect or imagination of apologists like Lee Strobel. Now, I didn't script this next bit because I figured I would just share some final parting thoughts about, not about the case for a creator, but about the Atheist Read series in general and this entire enterprise. This is the 25th series. I've been doing this since 2012. And it feels good to not be doing it anymore, I'll be honest with you. I have such appreciation and gratitude for those of you who have left comments on the last few videos as we've gotten nearer and nearer the end, saying that you'll miss the series, asking me if I'll reconsider, asking me if I'll come back and do some more. And like I say, I have nothing but love and appreciation and gratitude that this has been of such use and such interest to those of you that it has been of use and of interest to. But it feels good to be done. When I decided that this would be the last year, one of the things I told myself was that I wanted to stop before I started to hate it. I didn't want to stop because I just couldn't stand to do it anymore. And I think that's the point that I'm at now. I'm glad that it's over. I'm glad to not be doing this anymore. I'm glad that I don't have Atheist Read series in my future. But I'm walking away from it at a point that I don't hate it. And I think I've just said all that I have to say about the various questions. Some of you have said in comments to episodes of this series and previous ones as well in the last couple of years that it was starting to get repetitive. Not necessarily any fault of mine. And in fact, one of the real joys of this last couple of years has been that I thought I actually did get kind of good at finding new creative ways to respond to the same old creationist and apologist arguments. There were a couple of scripts in this series and in the last one and the one before that as well, where I kind of patted myself on the back. I was like, oh, that's good. You know, that's a good analogy, or that's a good way of looking at it, or that's a good way of describing it. An argument that I had responded to countless times before, several times before at least. And I was able to find a new way of approaching it. I was kind of pleased with myself about that. So that was nice. But overall, I think the series had said all that it can really say and had begun to repeat itself, because apologists themselves repeat themselves and cannibalize each other's ideas and prop each other up. There were times reading this book when I thought, I think Christian apologetics is just a support network for discredited scientists. People who can't find fulfilling professional work as a scientist because they're creationists and they have been rightly ostracized by the mainstream scientific community. So people like Lee Strobel come along every few years and write a book and interview people and get their names out there, and they're invited to churches, or they're invited to creationist conferences, or they get to work for organizations like the Discovery Institute or Answers in Genesis, and they get to have a job and a career and a life, and they get to pretend like they're a scientist or pretend like they're a respected philosopher. It's just a support network. It's welfare for shitty scientists. I've had that thought quite a few times, especially reading this book. Some of you ask me and have asked me before, are there any of the books that you enjoyed, or are there any of the books that you liked? I liked both C.S. Lewis books. I enjoyed both Mere Christianity and Screwtape Letters, particularly the Screwtape Letters. I think that's probably going to wind up being my favorite of all the books that I've done for this show. Lewis was definitely the best writer. Holly Ordway, who wrote Not God's Type, that I reviewed in one of the series from last year, I think is a likable person. Just judging her from the book, judging her from her writing, I had some empathy for her, some affection for her as I was reading. I disagreed with her about everything. I think she's just as wrong and just as misguided in her thinking on these subjects as any other apologist I've ever read. But I didn't come away feeling like I was angry with her, or feeling like she was trying to pull one over on me or trying to con me out of anything. I felt that she was a very sincere, honest person who was just really, really wrong about some stuff. And that was nice. It's nice to read a book written by someone who you don't come away thinking less of them as a person. You just disagree with them. That was nice. So I have to say, I have to throw Holly Ordway out there as well. But generally speaking, I take kind of a dim view of most of the authors of this series. I don't have very many nice things to say about Ray Comfort or William Lane Craig or Lee Strobel or Josh McDowell or Norman Geisler. I don't think they're necessarily willfully deceptive, but I think that they are misleading people. And as I said in this video, they're selling people a faulty product, and they are not being honest about the fact that that's what they are doing. I think they must at least have some awareness that they are making a sales pitch to people. And they insist that they are not doing that when that is clearly what they're doing. And I'm not capable of respecting that. And I'm not capable of respecting apologetics as a field, as an enterprise. I think theology can be a legitimate field of study, a legitimate field of inquiry. I think certainly philosophy is a very important, vital area of human endeavor. I have great respect for philosophy and for philosophers, for people who know a lot more about it and are much more attuned and well-read and fluent in the complexities of philosophy than I am. I think that's probably been the area where my own personal limitations and my own personal lack of studiousness and lack of education has come through. I think there are times when you can tell I'm an English major, or that I was an English major in this series, and that works in my favor. And there are times when you can tell that I'm an English major and it shows my deficiencies in scientific or philosophical matters. But I think that those are legitimate fields. I think that those are legitimate endeavors. I don't think apologetics is. But at the same time, I do think that it matters if you are a person who cares about these things, if you are a person who is interested in questions of God, of religion, of secularism versus religion, of separation of church and state, of what the proper role of religion should be in our society and in our lives. If that is something that is important to you, I do think maybe it's worth reading one of these books. Maybe not 25 of them, but one or two of them maybe, to see what the arguments are, to see what people think, to see what justifications people have for their beliefs. to see what rationalizations people turn to explain the fact that their obvious truth has been rejected by the overwhelming majority of the scientific community. I think it's worth doing. And I think that this series has been worth doing. And I hope that I have accomplished what I hoped to accomplish with at least a few of you, which is that if you had one of these books given to you and you read it and you couldn't quite put your finger on what it was that you disagreed with or that you didn't find convincing, hearing my response, listening to what I had to say about it, hearing me explain my thinking and why I thought that this was a bad argument or this wasn't convincing, that maybe that helped you to crystallize your own thinking. That's probably my highest goal with this, to help other skeptics, other atheists, other non-religious folks, to help them clarify their own thinking, not to tell them what to think, not to say you have to see this the way I see it, not to say that I'm right and anybody who says otherwise is wrong, because obviously that is not the case. But just to give you my own perspective, and hopefully hearing my perspective would help you to continue down the path and solidify your own. So I hope that I've done that for some of you. And if I have, then it's all been worth it. And it's all been fun. And it's something that I'm very glad that I did. And that I'm also very glad to not be doing anymore. So obviously, not the end of the channel. I know a lot of you probably come to this series and these are the only videos of mine that you watch. And if that's the case, thank you so much. I appreciate your attention all these years. I would love it if you would stick around and watch some of my other videos. But if not, if you were just here for the Atheist Reads and now you're going to move on, that's fine. Thank you so much for being here. I'm more grateful to you than I can ever express. And I hope that it was worth it. And I hope that this is a satisfactory conclusion for you. And I hope that if you still want things like this, that you can find them somewhere else, either on YouTube or in books or podcasts or whatever. But yeah, this is it for the Atheist Read series. I am going to continue to do atheist, religious-themed content in the future. I know what the replacement series for this will be next year. Starting next week, this slot in my production schedule will be filled by Steve and Stuffy videos, which are my very favorites, and I can't wait to get back into that full time. But after Steve and Stuffy wraps up for this season in December, I'll be back in January with a new series that will be very different from the Atheist Read series, but will also be sort of religious, atheist in theme. Hopefully some of you will check it out and enjoy it. It will just be very different. It'll be very different than the Atheist Read series. And hopefully, when I get to the end of that new show, whenever that is, at some point in the future, I'll be able to look back at the production of it and say, you know what, that was worth making. Because that's what I can say now at the end of the Atheist Read series. I can say, you know what, for all the ups and downs and all the aggravation that it brought me, it was worth doing. And it brought me a lot of good things. And I hope that those of you watching can say that it was worth watching. And I thank you for watching.